How many of you, and this is not a test, and it's okay if you haven't, but how many of you have read Northwoods? Show of hands. Ooh, all right. Okay, so we're gonna maybe not go too spoilery, but I feel like we can go
Spoil a little bit.
spoil a little bit. Yeah, not a lot, but a little. So, I'm a New Englander. I grew up bird watching in the Connecticut woods, and I currently live in Litchfield County, which is not too far from the area where this book is set. And I have to say, I was shocked to learn that you're from California. So my first question is, how did you, a Californian interloper, come to know our woods so well?
Thanks. It was great being here. Actually, I have a problem with these microphones. I'm like famous for going like this. So if I do it, please shout in the back. Every once in a while, I'll make it somewhere. Like my mom was at a talk, and she'll say, "You know, we couldn't hear you for the first half hour," and I feel terrible. So tell me if that starts to happen. But you know, it's lovely to be here. I also just want to say thanks, Rebecca and Omar, and thanks to the Mark Twain House. We got a tour of the house before coming to this. And it was really amazing. I had no idea that it was so elaborate. So I thought he was a Californian writer.
Oh, see, it's a common misconception.
That's what we say out there.
Right.
And for many years I lived in the shadow of Berkeley, and I think that they would fighting words to hear about this house. But
we're off to a great
really
start.
kind of amazing, actually, though, to see. Now I'm digressing already, but I mean, just sort of astonishing to see, and I think it's such a testament to the imagination to see that the room. I mean, I never would have thought the room that he wrote Tom Sawyer and Huck Finn in, like, is that opulent.
Yeah. I know.
And you know, looks out on this New England landscape.
Yeah.
A lot of the book was written near Pittsfield.
Okay.
And I don't know if people have been up to Arrowhead, which is where Melville lived when he was writing Moby Dick. And that's also extraordinary to visit in part because here's this house very, very far from the sea. And the only thing suggestive of the sea or any kind of whale they say is Mount Greylock, which in the wintertime, when it's covered by snow, has sort of the faint outline of a whale. But other than that, it was all up here. So it's lovely to see that.
So that was similar. I mean, Pittsfield. So you were not super far, but
so most of the book was written combination of sort of northwestern Massachusetts, some areas upstate New York, just kind of romping around in the woods.
Yeah.
Southwestern Vermont, so near here. I mean, I think it's a little warmer here, but otherwise, you know, a lot of the. Yesterday I was in Salisbury, and then, you know, coming over here today, we had a chance to walk around a little bit. The woods are pretty similar.
Yeah.
So there's some wonderful differences, but.
Well, I pictured you writing it on a beach somewhere and thinking, "Gosh, how did he get all the birds right? This is so impressive."
No, so the book was written out here. So the idea for the book came. Actually, at the start of the pandemic, we came to stay with my wife's family who live in upstate New York, and that was in the fall. And that it was at that time when I was kind of walking around, and for a Californian to see all these walls and these cellars in the middle of the woods is just sort of astonishing.
Yeah.
I think that old history really got me excited. But then I had a year of fellowship to come, and so I spent the year here working on it. So like what you're mentioning with the birds in the woods, like, you know, in some ways it was the easiest research I've ever had to do for a book because I just had to go outside and see, and then, you know, make some adjustments for what would have happened over the last 300 years. But they're around. So like what birds are singing now in May, you know, I can just go outside and listen for them.
Yeah. And you referenced the Merlin app in your acknowledgments.
Yes. So walking around with the help of Merlin,
yes,
with the help
thank you, Merlin.
iNaturalist. So hopefully, I don't know if people know these programs, but these are two apps on the iPhone that.
Amazing.
It's sort of amazing to think that when I first became excited about the natural world, it was actually at a writer's colony, and there was this giant volume called Plants of Europe, and I would go out into the sort of grounds of this kind of amazing place that was in Italy that I've never been to a place like that again, but I had this Plants of Europe, and I would sort of go and I'd see, like, this plant looks like this, and, you know, I'd look through the book and I'd find it, you know, and then I'd find, well, this one, no, that's in Finland, so I have to stop and and it was so laborious, and now there are these amazing apps, and I hate my phone in many ways, but one of the things I love about it is I can take a picture of something and it'll tell me what it is, or record it and it'll tell me what it is.
So you know which mushrooms to eat and which to give to your enemies.
That I don't trust. Not the mushrooms, but
So you mentioned research and say, because I think maybe downplaying some of the research, because this book spans an enormous, the temporal breadth of this is incredibly impressive, and you have a number of literary forms that require different speech patterns, tones, vernaculars, word choice. So from just a historical standpoint, what was that research process like?
So, when I started, I have a friend who's very close and is kind of like almost like become like a literary coach for me, and he's seen what I've gone through with my different books. And the last novel that I wrote, it's a book called The Winter Soldier, took a really, really long time. Took 14 years, and it was kind of terrible. And part of the reason it took such a long time was because I would go down these rabbit holes, and I'd be doing this research, and I'd learn something, and then I'd start writing a chapter, and I'd forget it, and I'd go and I'd realize maybe I need to learn a little bit more about what surgery's like in the Army in World War I, and I'd read about it, and it went on and on. And so he said to me, for this one, no research. But I like history.
Yeah.
But I had that in my mind, and I also knew that I only had a year out here.
Yeah.
And then one thing that happened also early on is that I had started writing the book over the summer, and then it really began to pick up speed in the autumn when we came out here. And that's when I was writing there, because I wrote it chronologically.
Good.
And so I was writing these early chapters about apples and orchards, and it was fall, and I thought, in some ways I can't imagine writing anything else except for about fall right now. And then I thought, well, maybe to keep myself from spending 14 years on this, what I should do is only write in the season that the chapter takes place in.
Fascinating.
And try to keep that. And so, and it ended up being wonderful. One, because it kind of kept me from digressing, but at the same time also because you mentioned the research, that there was historical research, but in terms of like the landscape, truly I didn't have to go to a book and look what's around in winter or what blooms in the springtime, because I was working on that chapter then, and I can go outside.
Wow.
And so each of the chapters, I'd have then a month, and I'd have a month to try to find sources that I really liked for, say, the Revolutionary War, or for French and Indian Wars. And I was fortunate enough with a lot of them to find, one or two or three. I think for a writer who's writing historical fiction, that's the dream, is that the worst thing is to pick a topic like the Revolutionary War, which has like an entire library shelf for it. The best thing is to find a topic which is actually, reasonably obscure.
Yeah.
So you have like one or two or three books that you can base your work off of. Otherwise, you just have to get lucky. And so I think I was fortunate with some of the chapters that probably required the most amount of research. I was pretty lucky to find books which were just sort of were great and great guidance that meant that I didn't have to go sort of searching the archives for everything all the time.
That's fascinating and incredibly impressive. That timeline is short for how in-depth and how accurate everything is. My partner's a farmer, and he was very impressed by how scientifically precise the grafting was, the invasive species were, the spring ephemerals. So you got his stamp of approval right away.
Well, so the grafting, for that, that's one, for instance, like there are how-to guides. So like as a writer, and the great thing about does anyone here grafted apple trees before? So at one point in your life, everyone should graft an apple tree.
Careful to get pomomania.
One of the most astonishing moments for me was in the springtime of last year. I decided I was going to try to do this, and I had already written those seasons, because I'd written that in the fall, and so I got in the mail these little, they call them scions, and essentially they're just twigs, and you cut them in a particular way, but it's very simple. I do with my sons. And you stick them onto, so you're basically just sticking two pieces of wood together and wrapping tape around them. And you look at them and you think there's no way that this could actually be a tree. And then all of a sudden, a month later, you walk into the room and it's like starting to grow. And I did 10, and all 10 survived. And I absolutely have the worst. I have not a green thumb at all. I can't get anything. I tried to grow oaks from acorns. I thought this would work. I was like, 0 for 100. But the trees, they want to. It's like they want to survive. And so there are these guys. And also what's great about grafting is you can look on the internet and it'll tell you how to graft. But you can also read a guide, a horticultural guide from the 19th century, and it'll tell you how to graft. And you can also read Pliny the Elder, and it'll tell you how to graft, and it's the same way of grafting. So we haven't done. There's certainly been improvements, but that's one where they figured that one out
Pliny
pretty
had
quickly.
it pretty quickly. Amazing, amazing. So I had a friend who read this book, and she texted me about it and said, I'm just so frustrated. Every single chapter is so good it could be its own novel. And the characters feel so well developed and so lived in, and I don't want each chapter to end. Each of these feel like its own story. What was the experience like inhabiting each of these characters? Did you, especially with the vernacular shifts and things, and you've got language that's changing and time that's changing, what was that like?
Yeah, that's very kind of her.
She's right on.
I think, so I think I like writing short form.
Mm-hmm.
The book before this was a short story collection, and I love these other kinds of voices and these other kinds of sounds.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm not a musical person, but I have friends who are musicians. One in particular, who like can't not play a musical instrument that he finds, and that he loves uncovering strange, weird ones just to see what they're like. And that's a very familiar feeling.
Yeah.
And I think part of the fun part of doing this is that I think there's no way that my editor would have put up with the idea that I tell him that I was going to write something in ballad form for 340 pages, but he tolerated it in a couple of chapters.
Yeah.
And so, so just to kind of work with those sounds is a lot of fun. And in some ways they're very foreign, but in some ways they're very familiar because they make up the English.
Yeah.
And I think that's something I thought of at the start, but the book's about how like the forest that we walk into has its history. But as the book was going on, I was writing it, it began to have this feeling that, of course, this is the same thing about the language that we speak. It has this history, and we just don't necessarily see it, right? We would go mad if we had to think of the origin of every word we were using, but the words that we use actually have this kind of, have this kind of historical root in these other forms that are both foreign and yet very familiar. So, so that was it was just fun to sort of be able to be for a moment in these other kinds of Englishes that were foreign and yet familiar. And I also think that kind of kept it fresh. And also in some ways, I think one of the intimidating things about a novel is you're always afraid that you're going to get halfway through and all of a sudden it's not going to work anymore. And that's happened to me before. But there's something about this episodic quality that I think gave me a little bit more courage, because I just had to get through the next chapter.
Yeah.
And if it didn't work, that was all right, because there was going to be another one coming along.
Well, you did a masterful job of linking things. Like there was a 6 degrees of separation thing going on at some points, where I found sometimes with episodic novels, I get so invested in a character and then the character's gone and I can't get invested in the next one. And because there was overlap and the main character being the North Woods that's consistent in the house, I think it made it really easy to relate to each character, even the ones that I didn't like as much, in terms of like, man, you're the worst. Why are you doing that? Because they had this central tie through it, it made it so easy to follow along. And I don't know about you guys, but I tore through this. This was something I couldn't put down. I didn't want to stop reading it. And I think that the people I know that have read it, that I've spoke to, felt very similarly. Like it really carried you through in this way. You were racing to find out with the stories being so disparate, which is a feat. It was really impressive. It's not a question, just a compliment.
No, okay. Thank you.
So another tenet of being a New Englander, I come from a long line of atheists, and I'm not a super spiritual person, but I do believe in ghosts in old houses. Every time I'm in an old colonial house, I'm like, this is haunted. There is definitely some haunted stuff happening here. So did you always conceive this as sort of a haunted house ghost story, or did that sort of come about through an attachment to some of these characters and not really wanting to let them go? Like
Yeah, that's a great, so no, and I didn't think that was going to happen. And then it was really in the chapter, so I feel like it's fair to spoil it up until about halfway into the book.
Yeah, we agreed on that before.
so the chapter with Mary and Alice, which is where the supernatural first makes its way known, it was really only at the end of that chapter, after Mary kills Alice, when I I loved those characters, and I sort of didn't want them to go. And I think I was also aware that at that point, when I first conceived of the book, I didn't think the stories were going to be as connected. And I liked the idea of memory working, but almost more metaphorically. And I thought, like, why does this need to be metaphorical? Like, why can't literally the past remain? And how does the past remain when the past haunts? And so let her come back. And then at that point it became, and I was sort of ambivalent about it at first, and I've never written a ghost story before, and there are all these rules of ghosts, like, I don't know. And my sons immediately began to ask me these questions about ghosts, like, you know, can the ghosts pass through walls, or can dogs see the ghosts? And
good questions.
They're great questions. And you don't realize, like, every ghost story, the author has to know, like, what the rules of their ghosts are going to be. And so there's a moment actually when the seance occurs about halfway through the book. The clairvoyant who comes goes for about a paragraph into how she creates the rules of her ghosts, and that's a bit of my poetics of ghosts for the book, because her rules are my rules. Like, what are they allowed to do? And it's funny because there's some, you know, my kids can still punch holes in what my ghosts are allowed to do, but hopefully they're believable enough as ghosts.
That's excellent. I love that your children are budding literary critics of.
Oh yeah,
it's amazing.
There's a similar experience. I've taught fiction a couple times, and when an undergraduate writes science fiction, the same thing. You know, so I'll read it as from sort of a perspective of craft. But the best thing is to have undergraduates submit work of science fiction to the workshop, and then everyone else jumps on and says, so this spaceship is traveling in space. What would happen to the heat? I remember that was one. I didn't even understand that one, but apparently then, you know, it's too cold outside, but it's hot inside. Aren't they going to get too warm? You know, and then everyone sort of else jumps in and says, well, no, you know, they can deal with it in this way because you can circulate heat into the spacecraft. And, you know, like, there are rules of space exploration. There's rules of aliens. There's rules of ghosts.
Rules of ghosts.
Yeah.
That's amazing. This is going to be difficult, I think, to discuss without getting too spoilery, but I'm going to try. I think one of the things that I found so beautiful about your treatment of ghosts was this idea of maybe not getting what you wanted in life when you're alive, but finding that solace in death and having the afterlife not be a white clouds in the sky filled with people, but where you are with what you need. Is that something that you thought of when you were coming up with your ghost rules, or is that more of a character-driven decision, resolution?
That's great. You know, I think that, I mean, in some ways, that probably answers some of the like narrative demands, so that they remained in the story more, because I wanted the focus to be on that piece of land. And again, like, this is sort of spoiler alerty, but I think it's fair to say, like, in the last chapter of the book, in which there's a character kind of watching fast forward on the land. You know, it occurred to me later after I'd finished it that, I mean, she could be doing anything, right? Like, in the afterlife, you know, presumably. Again, I don't know what the rules are, but, like, I mean, you can meet anybody, you can travel anywhere, but what she wants to see is what's going to happen in this tiny patch of soil, and what's going to come along. So I felt that maybe that, like, I don't know if that was deliberate to answer your question, but it felt like the spotlight sort of needed to remain there. And so that's where these spirits remain.
I thought that was a stunningly beautiful choice, especially Charles, who in many ways, I think, you have the couple in the beginning, the Puritan couple absconding and the murder plot after that, but Charles Osgood for me is where the house really starts to begin. And the fact that he moves on and she stays, I thought was really powerful. The guy that really had it all and made the house what it was decides he's good to move along as the world starts to fall apart.
Well, he's committed to apples.
So he's just got to stay with those apples.
He's got to
follow the apples.
And
there is nothing like a good New England apple.
No, that is astonishment for a Californian to come and see that these things are everywhere. Like, I'm just used to seeing them in Whole Foods. And we would drive along the road, and these apple trees would be hanging over the road, and
Yeah.
just the road would be covered with apple pulp. And I'd think, like, why isn't everyone stopping and getting these apples? Like, am I allowed to get these apples?
Making blasphemous cider with them. Yeah.
Right.
Amazing.
But that, I don't know if people, and I think the other thing that's so wonderful, and I'm sure around here there's a lot. This area here, one thing I came to realize is that, everything's much older here, and also the settlement of this book is atypical. Like, they escape and they move up into they want to get away from people, and so they go into this area where there really wasn't much European settlement. It really, settlement really occurred along the Connecticut, really occurred along the coast, because it's hard to get into the mountains.
Yeah.
So I'm just astonished, like, when I come sort of to this part in Connecticut and Massachusetts, you really do find incredibly old trees, and it's wonderful because the apple is imported. If you find a fruiting apple, it was planted there by someone.
Yeah.
And so to be walking around in a state park, and it's like these gigantic pines everywhere, oaks everywhere, it's like old growth, and then you find an apple amidst it, that somebody put that tree there. Now, it's possible that a bird, brought it there accidentally.
I like to believe it's a
But
bird.
if it's fruiting and it's
Yeah.
a good tree, the chances are that it's a varietal, and somewhere around there's a cellar hole.
I love the idea of telling American history through nature and the things we do to it, and through a house. I think I've always loved old houses, but to follow a house through its history, I think oftentimes people will move into an old house and they'll think, oh, it's cool, it's on the registry, and not think about who else lived here, what things happened here, what sort of
Right, no.
things happened in the bedrooms here that are haunting an anxious woman. It's
No, it's astonishing, right? Like, it's such an intimate space.
Yeah.
And yet, at the same time, you know nothing about the people. For the most part, you know nothing about the people who, like, slept in the bed. Like, literally, sometimes literally the people who slept in your bed. But at least, like, looked out at the view and saw the deer that were coming by, or saw the light when it came in a particular way.
Yeah.
And I think for me, I had never thought of that. Part of that's being from California. Most of the places I've lived in are as old as I am, many of them younger than I am, and so we don't have that same sense of history. There weren't that many people there, but certainly here, the amount of history that took place in every one of these houses.
Yeah.
And frankly, like, the bloodlands that this place
Yeah.
is, like, I think that's at some point, it like occurred to me that everybody in the book dies. Like, there's like there's incredible body count in the book, but not just because, there is some murder that occurs in the book, but just because that's what's going to happen if it's a book that takes place over 300 years. And each one of those deaths, each one of the conceptions, if they occur in this house, like, there's a lot of stuff that occurs in the spaces. I was just walked by Mark Twain's bedroom, and I wanted to know what side he slept on and his wife slept on. And his wife wanted to sleep next to have people been and seen his bed? Like, it's so odd, like, that they didn't, the way they oriented the bed. So if it's not like the headboard's against the wall, it's at one side of the bed's against the wall, because I guess his wife wanted to sleep against the wall. But then all of a sudden, this incredibly intimate image that, like, every time she needs to get up, she's crawling over him.
Yeah, I hadn't thought about that when I did the tour. This is why you're the writer. That's right. And the Mark Twain house had several iterations. It wasn't just Mark. That was what surprised me so much on the last tour, was that there was housing at one point, and it's had this rich history of people living it other than Mark Twain. I just sort of was, and I've lived here my whole life, under the assumption after Mark Twain moved out, it was a museum, and that was just not the case.
No.
So
yeah, someone could tear it apart.
Yeah.
I just heard a little bit of the history, but
it's incredible.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's amazing. So this is kind of a softball question, but I'm just very curious. Did you, in writing this book, have a favorite character, or one that you just really held closer than the others?
I think that this, I like the sisters a lot. In part, like, I'm with them for a long period of time. And I think that any character that surprises me tends to be one that I like, just because it's exciting for me because I don't know what's going to happen
Yeah.
next. And I felt like, pretty early on, Mary More Than Alice was like that. So
Yeah.
that here's somebody who's, she's working hard, she's lifting stones. I mean, that in itself felt sort of unusual, but then also that she has this great capacity for violence.
That shocked me.
But, right.
I should have seen it coming, but I gasped. I was like, Mary, how could you?
And several times,
Yes.
right? And so then she can kind of redeem herself. But I love then later on when she came back that she's still kind of grumbling and she's still sort of a pain and like she's still kind of working out her anger issues. So like every time she appeared, I felt like she could sort of surprise me. So I really liked her. I really like Morris Lakeman at the end of the book.
Yeah.
And I just feel a lot of sort of affection for him, and it's like he seems like a compassionate, interesting person.
I feel like we all know a Morris Lakeman.
We all know someone who brings the binoculars out when they check the mail. Yeah.
Yes.
definitely.
And gives a fake address. That's sort of a spoiler, but I loved that. I loved that whole chapter. I was thinking he really was given it, and it was mirror, bless.
Yeah.
He was wonderful. So, in addition to being a prolific and very talented writer, you are also a psychiatrist and a professor. So, A, how do you do it all? And B, how do these parallel careers inform and enhance your career as a writer?
So, I mean, one thing, like I do them, they kind of leapfrog each other, I should say. That when I first started out, I had a lot more energy. And so then I, would go to lecture and I didn't go out very much, but I would go to lecture and then, maybe go back and I'd be thinking about something and I'd be excited to write. Like it was sort of this is before I published anything, but it was like a hobby and it was exciting. And I think in some ways, being in medicine and being, in your 20s and sort of seeing the big bad things happening in the world for the first time, writing worked as a way to sort of process that. And then as time has gone on, what I've found is that it's pretty hard to, I really can't, like, they have these stories of William Carlos Williams driving around and he'd like deliver a baby and then he would stop his car and he'd be like writing a poem on the top of the car. And I've never.
His are shorter.
His were some pretty complicated stuff, but I couldn't even pull off a poem, let alone an email sometimes at the end of the day. So it's been, for the most part, as like I don't really have kind of a rhythm, but as I've settled more or less into one, I tend to work in the hospital for a couple months a year, teach, and then when I'm not doing either of those, then I'm writing. And in some ways that they feel like they overlap. It feels like it overlaps. In the sense that I think as a psychiatrist or any kind of physician, you're constantly trying to take a story and process a story and kind of distill a story. It's sometimes even less than like listening to someone, but the act of describing. Imagine they're physicians here. Like every time you tell a patient's story to another doctor or consult another doctor, you condense that person's story as much as possible, and you tell the story. That always feels a lot like editorial work, sometimes like writing. So there's some overlaps like that. I think about this a lot because there's times where I've thought, like there have definitely been times where I thought maybe I want to stop practicing and I just want to write, and that's never happened. And I always find great comfort going back and working in the hospital and working on teams and sort of being part of like the busyness of the world, which feels like a big relief sometimes.
Isolating writing.
To the isolation of writing. Yeah,
for sure. That's wonderful. Was it difficult to write about? And again, this is sort of a spoiler, but we're sort of the midpoint. What I have come to call the lobotomy plot. Was that difficult from being someone that practices medicine and do no harm and writing from the point of view of someone who, we know now that a harmful procedure for many folks? Was that difficult? Were you able to kind of have that professional distance from it?
Sure. So, one reason I mentioned the Winter Soldier earlier, one reason that book was so hard for me is I began writing it from the perspective of a psychiatrist. And I think that part of the trouble, maybe it was because I was starting out as a psychiatrist, I was always thinking, I can't make the psychiatrist a bad guy because everyone's going to think it's me. And they're going to think I'm a terrible doctor. And I just like, what's going to happen? And then maybe it's just like enough time has passed. And like I can just sort of, I mean, the book has an extended sex scene about a beetle. So at a certain point I have to
I'm glad you brought it up.
accept the fact that people aren't going to think like what goes on in the book goes on in my own personal life.
Oh, so I shouldn't ask that question?
Well, I don't know what question you're asking about that one, but there's like a certain amount of like, of course it comes from my mind, but like, in writing so hard, like to feel inhibited and to be worried about, like what a colleague is going to think, like just, would, sort of makes me choke. Like kind of like a baseball player. Like it was just, and so, but I think as time has passed, I felt a little bit more comfortable writing it. And so my wife, when I told that I was going to have this character that has pretty severe psychosis in the book, she like looked at me like, oh my God, we just went through 14 years of this, and like it's a mistake, and you kept on telling me every day. I mean, I teach a class on the literature of psychosis, and one of the punchlines of the class is this is a very hard experience to write about because almost by definition, people's experiences can't really be communicated, and that's what makes them so difficult. And the works that communicate it well are really few and far between, and have certain techniques that they use. And so the thought of like trying to do this, she thought like, what are you doing? And part of what happens is that I never tell the book from the perspective of Robert, the person who has the schizophrenia diagnosis, but really it's more about the other people in his life, the mother, his sister, and then this doctor. And I mean that's part of. I don't name it as lobotomy because I want it to be free from that particular history. Yeah. But in the history of psychiatry, lobotomy is but one of many. There's what a historian calls great and desperate cures. And great is not meant as like good, but great is like kind of outlandish.
Major,
yeah. And so he was interesting. I mean, in some ways he's very sinister, but at the same time, I hope he comes off as somewhat complex.
Yeah, definitely.
In that, like, part of him, he doesn't think he's doing it.
No.
He's deluded in his own way, and thinking that he's convinced himself in some kind of evil way. He's convinced himself that somehow this is the right.
I mean, it's of the time. Science is progress until we find things out about it that think, well, maybe we shouldn't do that. So it's.
And there are many people at that time who feel this is like very much, who understand the ethical objections, but he has convinced himself otherwise, and that kind of person is then interesting to me.
Yeah.
How they, rather than someone who's sort of purely bad, someone who's doing something which we understand to be wrong, but at the same time at the moment sort of so lost in their own sense of power, and I think he's lost in his sense of power also.
I mean, I think this book is unique in that there's really not a single character in it that I would describe as purely evil. I mean, it's human. There's people that make decisions for selfish reasons. I think of William's nurse. That really got me, and I'm not going to spoil that, but a sympathetic character, and I think that's a really strong point in the book, is that life is a spectrum, and there's no good and evil, and everyone has their motivation and is trying to do what they can in the world, and I thought that you handled that really beautifully. Again, not a question, just a comment.
Okay, not a question. Thank you.
But on the topic of Robert, I thought it was really interesting that you made the link between schizophrenia and sort of a connection to, almost a medium-esque connection to the spirit world. And I wasn't sure where you were going with it until his sister discovers the Super 8s and how he'd named them. So how was that? Was that challenging from a clinical standpoint to kind of make that connection, or did you think there was something to it? Like, I thought that was really fascinating and really a beautiful way to sort of describe the schizophrenic experience, but also it seemed in the context of the book like he really was having these encounters with the ghosts.
I mean, I think he's, even though there's not a chapter which is to say his own writing, in some ways he's a character. I mean, I didn't exactly tally this up, but he's in some ways a character who appears in maybe more chapters than anyone else, and sort of represents, I would say, like a kind of the conscience of the book.
Yeah.
And in ways, I think that this is something that like we encounter in everyday life or in clinical experience, or those of us who have family members who experience severe psychosis, recognize that, while on one hand it's very disruptive and can really make someone's life miserable and make life for their loved ones very difficult. At the same time, people recognize that a lot of times what's being discussed or what's tormenting a person has a profound truth. And so in some ways, the suffering that occurs is the inability to filter the truth out and the inability to kind of keep the truth in its place. And so his belief in the book, which is essentially that he has the ability and the duty to kind of keep the world together, and if he doesn't carry out these certain rituals, the natural world's going to come apart. Is in some ways, as the doctor would describe it, delusional, but at the same time, ultimately represents a complete truth, which is that like we have as our responsibility the need to protect the natural world, and if we don't carry out the essential rituals, it's all going to come apart.
Interesting.
That's not delusional at all, and,
No.
and something that I think we're increasingly beginning to recognize.
Yeah.
We're just not tormented by it enough.
Yeah, that's wonderful. I mean, on that note, I think two of the characters that would be described as having more of a selfish motivation, Mary, William's nurse, I wondered, was there sort of an extension, especially with Mary, she doesn't want anybody else coming into their Eden, this is their space. Is there a through line there with protecting and keeping natural spaces sort of as an edifice, or letting everybody have access to nature so they come to understand its beauty and appreciate it?
Yeah, that's it's always such a complicated question, and you read these stories about like the area around Chernobyl that's kept, like literally people can't enter.
Yeah.
That apparently now their nature is flourishing.
Yeah, it's thriving.
And I think one of the sort of tensions in thinking about this book. So one, I mean, that idea is always very interesting to me. And you read these stories about people buy private land and they close the land off for people to enter, and of course you want public access, but at the same time, what's best for the plants and animals? I mean, there's just like these constant questions that are really kind of complicated.
Yeah.
I think that I think the nice thing about fiction in some ways is that you don't have to answer them.
Yeah, it's a pretty impossible question to answer.
And let the policymakers decide.
Yeah, yeah. That's fantastic. So let's switch from the human characters to the animal characters, because they are just as important. And you brought it up, not me. But the beetle sex scene was about the most erotic thing I've ever read in my life. And I couldn't finish 50 Shades of Grey, so that's on me. But there is moments of intimacy between human beings in the book, but nothing as intimate as the Beatles. So I'm not going to ask about your personal life, but I'm going to ask about where did that idea come from? That is so unique. It was so interestingly sexy. You read a lot of books where people are trying to shock and awe and titillate, and you gave it to the Beatles. Where did that come from?
So let's see. So when I started writing it, the book, one thought that I had was, especially because I started thinking about it during the pandemic, and there really wasn't anyone around. And it was so fascinating actually to return even just a year later and finding myself in towns that previously I thought were these sort of like remote abandoned towns that actually were filled with lots of people and shops, and but it really it was empty of humans. And so I think a thought early on was not just that nature would be a setting, but that an active protagonist. If we think of sort of the elements of the novel, and so the trees would be protagonists, and plants and the fungi would be protagonists, and these animals would be protagonists, and of course then, well, what does that mean? Protagonists have desires and fears, and and everything reproduces, and so this thought was sort of there. And then as I was reading about Dutch elm disease, I was reading about the beetle. So the beetle carries a fungus into the elm trees, and I found this amazing book that was on the, I forget, I don't acknowledge any sources except for the Beatles sex source in the back of the book.
If you want to read more.
And I think published in California Agriculture. And I was reading about it, and I read about how the female beetle, have people seen what these chambers look like? Like if you find an elm tree that's been knocked down, you peel off the bark. There's an illustration in the book. It's extraordinary. The details are just absolutely gorgeous. And if they hadn't destroyed all these glorious street trees that lined every single street in New England, they'd be really beautiful, but it ends up being kind of tragic. Yeah. But then in reading about it, I read that this little beetle crawls in, makes this little chamber, and then releases these pheromones that drift out of this tiny little hole and travel into space, and miles away the male beetle can sense this and is so attracted that he can then find that tree and find that little hole and find her inside. And so I can't do that. No one else. Pretty impressive.
It's pretty impressive. He's committed.
So
step it up, man.
so at that point, it seemed like if that was going to be the dirty chapter in the book.
I mean, perfect. I do want to save some time for audience questions, but while we're on the topic of animals, I would be remiss not to discuss the catamount quickly, who gets the top billing in terms of the cover.
Yep.
There is a lot of controversy in New England about whether we still have mountain lions
Yes.
circulating. People will fight about it. Do you have an opinion? Do you think they're still about?
It's like asking me whether I believe in ghosts
Yes,
or not.
exactly.
I
And
can't
maybe
tell
more
you.
loaded.
I have not seen one with my eyes.
Okay.
I can't say.
Well, I think you've willed it into
I would
existence.
love it if they were around. This is what, like one of these questions. Like I would absolutely love it. The forests would love it because there'd be fewer deer and the trees could actually grow. And but at the same time, it would make hikes more complicated. But, we
It's
have them
true.
in the West, and we're fine with them.
Yeah, we'd be
but-
fine with them too.
But yeah. So I have not seen one yet, but I've had a lot of people tell me that they've seen them, and then a lot of people tell me no, those are just very large bobcats.
I think it's like
but-
the Bigfoot of New England at this point.
No, it's funny. I worried a little bit that I was going to be wandering into some kind of controversy because there's a lot of very strong opinions
Yes.
on whether the catamount's around. Do people call it catamount here in Connecticut?
No.
You call
Cougar,
it cougar.
panther, mountain lion.
Yeah, I think catamount's really a
Yeah.
northern New England
Yeah.
thing. Like in
gonna
southern
call it
Vermont, everything's catamount. It's like Catamount
Yeah.
High School, the Catamount Motor Lodge. And then
Excellent.
I don't think that made it into the book, but there's a place called the Catamount Motor Lodge. And
I love that.
I never stayed at the Catamount Motor Lodge, but I always wanted to stay at the Catamount Motor Lodge.
Maybe on the book tour they'll
Right.
have you. Thank you, Daniel. That was amazing. I would love to open it up to the audience to give you guys some time to ask questions. I'm sure you have lots of questions. So anyone want to jump right in? I'll give you my mic. Saw you first.
So I just find it fascinating as we, as a society and medical, we're coming up with all these new developments, and you just sort of hit the sweet spot as far as being a psychiatrist. And I'm reading more novels where it's like they're going back in time and saying, guess what? This person probably had autism, or this person probably had some bipolar, or so I loved that you brought in these issues, I guess I can call them issues, into the story and wove them in, which it is fascinating to me to look back in time and say, okay, well, guess what, these historical figures had issues, that some went to the Springs or had depression or went to the sanatorium. So are you going to write more about including those topics? Because I just find them fascinating.
Yeah. I think that, so you asked about, practicing medicine and then writing. I think that one of the tensions in some ways is that, as we medicalize the world, which, I think you know, if someone was once, you know, hearing voices and was burned as a witch, then, you know, medicalization has certainly offered a certain advance over that response. But at the same time, medicalization has, you know, simplified complex human experience, because the goals of medicine, I think the goals then of literature in this case end up being very different. And I think that's one of the tensions, one of the places where I think the two careers can complicate each other, is that like the impulse in any kind of medical practice is to take kind of the chaos of everyday life and simplify it down enough that you can make a diagnosis, that you can use treatment guidelines to come up with the best treatment that people have come up with. But that you don't want in fiction, because you want the lives to be messy, and you want there to be mysteries, and you want there to be unanswered questions. And so it's sort of fascinating to try to, you know, there are times where I feel like, and especially with writing a character like Robert, there are times like I'd be thinking like, you know, sort of what's good for his treatment, what's good for the book.
Interesting.
And, you know, and what do I want to explain away? What would I want what a colleague to understand of his experience? But at the same time, would that understanding take away the experience of him, like as a person who is complicated and doesn't fit the criteria that we would regularly use? So it's an interesting dynamic to be in.
Good question. Anybody else? Orange shirt. Oh, he's a good voice, good projection.
You wrote about Charles in the beginning of the book, and who he is at the end of the book, because they're different people, and how you see that individual evolving from A to B.
Sure. And I think that it really feels like, I'm happy talking about this. I'm sorry if some people have not read the whole book. I'll try not to give away like the punch lines of the book, but in some ways this is fun for me. Like I did a tour at the beginning of the book and no one had read it, and like I couldn't give away anything in chapter 2. So it's sort of, but it's fun to talk about it, and you know, to hear about the end of the book. So this in some ways goes back to like this question of the rules of the ghosts. And you know, I remember thinking when he appears, what is he like? Because in some ways he hasn't changed because he's no longer alive, but at the same time, by the rules of the ghost in the book, time has continued to pass, and he's continued to sort of absorb society around him. And one of the, I think, scenes in the book that I spent the most time writing and rewriting is this sort of speech he gives at the beginning, because not at the beginning of the book, but when he meets Nora in the car and they're driving, there's about a page and a half in which he kind of launches into this somewhat confusing speech about these different things that he's doing and the people's pools he's visiting, and and I was trying to kind of come up with like this very particular vernacular which looked like what somebody who spoke English during the Revolutionary era but had accrued slang from the next 200 years sounded like, and there's not too many examples. So you know, and I had to resort to some paraphrase there and some sort of general description in which she sort of describes him as, you know, she notices that. That's what it sounds like. And so, you know, I see him as like the ghosts in the book kind of go on living and they notice things. And, you know, I mentioned that everyone stays, but they don't actually stay. A lot of people move on because they don't want to be there. They want to be somewhere else. And so I see him as somebody who, you know, he loves his trees. You know, he appears at another point in the middle of the book to like let people know that he's unhappy with the treatment of the trees. And so then when he comes back at the end, he's someone who's really seen the area change also. And so, you know, it's fun to think about. I mean, I don't know what it would actually be like to be that guy, but I see him as somebody who was who he was, but like he's continued to grow and change over time.
Yes.
Developing all these characters within the house, or did they sort of develop as you went along? You said you wrote chronologically, but it's so interwoven and there's so much foreshadowing in it and so many surprises that how much of it did you have all at once, and how much did you conceive as you went along?
Yeah. great question, and I'll just repeat it just in case people didn't hear the first part of the question, and that is, when I wrote it, how much did I know? How much had I plotted beforehand? So very little, and this was part, I think, in response to, and I keep on bringing up, I'm like, I have PTSD from writing The Winter Soldier. In some ways, I think everybody's book is a reaction to the last book and the mistakes that they made in the last book. I think a lot of writers would say that. Or it's trying to push yourself away from things that you didn't like from it, or expand on something that you did but didn't have a chance to develop further. And that book I had plotted out, at least I thought that I had plotted out everything. And it was just a matter of coloring it in. And that took the fun out of it, because there was no surprises that was going to occur. And the best I could do was sort of approach, like, asymptotically this ideal that I had imagined. And so with this, I felt like I know broadly that this is going to run from the past, from essentially the earliest sort of permanent structure that would occur in New England up until, I thought the book would actually run farther into the future, up until the very end. And so I had imagined actually a couple chapters that would take place after the present day. But I knew that, and then I knew it would run from June to June. And after that, I had some touchstones, like I love clairvoyance. I love sort of this what seances represent, and so I knew I wanted that. I love Pulp Fiction, so I knew that I wanted a chapter that had Pulp Fiction, and I would keep little notes as I went along. But I think part of the fun was sort of not really knowing what the people were going to do next, and then the part that was really fun is finding that these things that had been left behind would all of a sudden appear later on. And so like there's a bit at the end where Morris is looking for an axe, because he thinks that he can dig, chop this tree down and find something underneath the ground. And like literally as I was writing, he's like, "Where's the axe? Where's the axe?" And that's like me as I'm writing, like how could have I gotten here to this point in the book and not remember to put an axe somewhere around that he can find it? Because this is a house in New England. There's got to be axes everywhere.
Yes, here, I can just give you mine, save some room.
Thank you. I enjoyed the book very much. To piggyback off what you just said, what in your next book, what are you carrying through?
Like what I'm working on now?
No. You said that each book is a response to the old one.
Oh,
so
yeah.
where?
Sure. Oh my God, that's a great question.
Now
yeah.
in that?
Yeah, I'd really deserve that. Yeah. So I think that, fortunately, like I can say that. Again, every time it's like the psychiatrist in me. It's like every time you ask a question about Northwoods, I bring up Winter Soldier. It's like talking to someone, you ask them about their wife, and then they mention the girlfriend before they got married, and then you begin to get worried. But I think that fortunately with this book, there was a lot that was enjoyable about it, which again was kind of new for me. And so in some ways, it's like I almost tell myself now as I'm working on something, and I'm working on something new, but it's hard. It's always hard. And so like I'm constantly trying to have to like give myself little pep talks and remind myself things. And some of the things that I'm telling myself are like trying to find humor in it. That really kind of kept me, the moments that like if I could be chuckling in front of the computer by myself or walking to the house or like talking to my dog or something, but find a kind of enjoyment there, that really kept it going. So like that, if I'm stuck, like I'll ask that, like, is there a way to find some kind of lightness in this topic? Not over plotting it, and really kind of like letting as much these. So there's this wonderful line in Cannery Row, which is one of my favorite books, John Steinbeck's Cannery Row, where he talks about that there are these little flatworms, marine flatworms, that are so delicate that you can't actually grab them. But the only way that you can look at them is by taking a knife and letting the flatworm crawl onto the blade of the knife, and then you can look at it. And I always think about that when I'm writing. And he says, he brings that up in the context. That's what I'm going to do in this book with these stories. It's like I'm going to gently let the knife down and like let this little worm, sort of strange thing, crawl onto it so I can look at it. And that I also think about a lot. Like I'm not going to try to grab it and pull it out, but I'm going to try to create a place where something can kind of emerge. And a lot of times it doesn't. So.
All right, we've got time for one more.
As a psychiatrist and an author of non-academic books, how do you manage the exposure that you expose yourself as an author of novels? How do you manage that with your psychiatry practice, and is that a struggle for you?
That's a wonderful question. I think that was part when I referenced that with the Winter Soldier. I think that was something that I was trying to work through. Part of I think really my answer to that's just a very practical one, and that is I work in a hospital and I work on a team at an academic hospital, and so there are really like 6 core other people on the team: nurses, medical students, residents, social workers, occupational therapists, physical therapists, and then actually even more people. And so in some ways my role there is just as like the medical consultant on this much larger team. I don't have individual patients, and that's not to say it can't be done. So one of my mentors and a writer I admire immensely is a man named Irvin Yalom, who was also at Stanford for many years, and he sees individual patients, and some of their lives he writes about. I mean, he gets permission in different kinds of ways, and he's brilliant, I think, as a therapist, as a writer, but also as a therapist, in that he very much brings that trouble that you mentioned into the room, and uses it therapeutically. And I think it truly does. I mean, I think certain patients seek him out. People can kind of tolerate that, but he uses that. Like, what's it like for you to be talking to me as your therapist? Knowing that you could see what I wrote about other people. Like, he'll use that, but and so I think that it can be done in that way. But I don't do that. And so the practical answer is that I'm it's part of this team. So I don't worry about that quite as much. And a lot of my patients also, are people who have, a lot of the condition are people who have psychosis associated with dementia, say, and my novels are just it's just not the first thing on their mind. There's like a lot of other stuff going on in their life, and I like that. I like keeping it separate, and every once in a while it comes up. But again, usually I think, again, because of Dr. Yalom's example, it can come up in a, I'll ask what they think, or have they read it, and sometimes a person has or they hasn't. But again, and I've always found that it's been, at least from my point of view, I don't know actually truly what it's like, but it hasn't felt like it's gotten in the way of their care. But I'm worried. I think about that. I wrote the last short story that I published was a short story about a man. I never write about my patients, and that's something that has been very clear to me. And the last short story I wrote is a short story about a man who psychiatrist writes a case history of him, and the complexity of that relationship. So it's something very much on my mind.
Well, unfortunately, we are out of time. I think we would all agree we could talk to Daniel forever. I want to thank all of you for coming out. I'd love to thank Omar and the whole Mark Twain team for bringing this together. And most of all, thank you to Daniel for writing this beautiful book and sharing your vision with us, and for being with us today.
Thanks, Rebecca. That was wonderful. And thanks, everybody, for coming.
Daniel will be signing books out in the lobby. If you don't have a copy, you can get one at the store. When you go to get your book signed, please keep it brief. I'm sorry to break the bad news, but we all want to go home this evening. So, and we have a lot of people in the audience. So, if you can imagine 100 people, a minute each, that would be 100 minutes. So please keep it brief. Thank you.